all the previews were packed and sold out, and we went in and spoke to the audiences, and the audiences were very responsive, clapping loudly and cheering and everything, and all going back to see it again. And it was on Thursday evening, and the movie was opening on the Friday, and we got a text message when it was about almost midnight. We'd just finished the last showing I think in Shanghai, and we got a text message, or at least the actress did, because it was in Chinese, so we couldn't read it. But the lead actress, who was in the elevator with us at the time, said, "The movie's not playing tomorrow." I said, "What do you mean? We've just done 5 days of publicity, and they've already sold tickets, and it's been advertised for weeks." Well, apparently it's not playing tomorrow.
According to Variety, before Outcast was released, there were already sequel plans in the works. Quote, "Outcast has been acclaimed by buyers, and we are determined to make a sequel," said producer Jeremy Bolt at a public ceremony for the signing of an Outcast 2 Memorandum of Understanding. Little did Jeremy Bolt know that 24 hours before the release of the original Outcast, the plug would be pulled. Not on the sequel, but on the original film. This is the story of Outcast, through the eyes of its director, Nick Powell.
Well, one of my colleagues, a stunt coordinator in the UK, was a guy called Simon Crane, who Simon's a second unit director and stunt coordinator, and he's done a lot of very good work. He just really got into stunt coordinating at the time, and got the job of being stunt coordinator on Braveheart. And he knew I'd done a lot of sword work, and he wanted a modern take on sort of a more or should I say, a less old-fashioned version of sword fighting, a bit more involved. And so he asked if I would be interested in doing all the sword work on Braveheart. I'd been a stuntman for about 5-6 years, I guess. I qualified as a stuntman when I was 22, and I think I did Braveheart when I was 28, 29. And he asked if I'd do all the fights on Braveheart and choreograph everything, and which I did. And that kind of led to people thinking I was a sword guy. And I hadn't really intended ever to be a sword guy. It was one of those things that I'd done a fair amount of sword work, but I had a lot of other things that I was doing as well. And I'd started to coordinate a lot of stuff and car chases and, falling and just general things, fights. And so all of a sudden, after Braveheart, everybody was it was a slightly different version of sword work than people had seen. It was a bit more, in your face, a little bit more violent and sort of all there. It was a different way of seeing the fight sequences in movies at that point. And so I got calls to do Zorro and a couple of other movies at the time where they were asking me, would I come and do the sword work on Zorro? Would I come and do the sword work on? And I basically turned them down because I didn't want to get known as a sword guy. I was deliberately trying to become an all-around stunt coordinator and not just a sword guy. So that was kind of how I really started into the film side. And then after I'd done Braveheart and turned down Zorro and a few other things, I went back to coordinating TV shows with car chases, modern things, and lots of other small movies, etc. And then Gladiator came up, and I hadn't really done a lot of sword work at that point again for a few years, and so I figured, hey, I've gone out and done a lot of modern stuff and car chases and everything else, and now it's time to go back and do a bit of sword work again and battles. So I went back and did Gladiator. As a stunt performer, yes, you have a chance to express yourself, but it's usually you're doing what other people tell you to do and everything else, and you perform and you walk away, and you don't have the big responsibility of the making everything look good on the movie, just your thing. Sort of, I guess about 12 years ago or so, I got approached again. Would I be interested in directing a movie? And I turned down a lot of stunt work for that one, and that movie didn't happen. And then another one came up, and I turned that down. So it seems sort of as though everything happened relatively quickly at the end, but there was a long period of time whereby I was attached to movies to direct. That never happened for about 3 or 4 years. So I turned down the action stuff for a while, and then realized that the movie wasn't going to happen, and I'd go back and do some action, and because it's one of those things. Unless you're very lucky when you're starting out as a director, it takes time. And in the independent film world, people tell you they've got their funding together in the hope that basically by lying, I know I shouldn't be saying this, but a lot of people tell you they have everything ready to go, and then you find out after 2 or 3 months that it's not really ready. It's kind of, they know where they want to go to get their funding, and things take time. And so, I remember on one show, actually even on Outcast, which was the first movie I directed, I ended up, I think, waiting over a year from when they told me I was, it was ready to happen. And, I turned down two fairly big jobs that year in order to sort of wait around, and then found out that, all the time I'd been being told, it's happening next month. And, there was absolutely no way it was happening next month, but I wasn't aware of it. And so for quite a time, you hang around, and then you have to go and do something else. And as I said, Outcast, from when I signed and they told me the movie was happening, took over a year of me sort of turning things down for it to actually be greenlit and go ahead. I believe at the time I was doing Resident Evil with Paul Anderson, and Jeremy Bolt was producing. And Jeremy said, you should be directing, I've got a script. And he gave me a script, which was the Outcast script. But it was very, very different from the one we ended up shooting. It's a Knight Templar going to China and essentially sort of finding himself in China. It was a similar storyline, but quite different from what we ended up shooting. And that was the script that I got sent. And I sort of quite liked the script. I thought it was a good, sort of comic book type genre pick, and I liked the idea of it. And then basically it went through rewrite after rewrite. And at that point, as I said, there was only one night that went to China, and that was Hayden originally. And then it started to get rewritten and get bigger. And then Nick came on board, and they combined some of the characters from China into the character that Nick played. So it was kind of being rewritten constantly. I think we had the original writer came back in for a few weeks, then another writer came in, and then the producer basically dictated all his notes, and they got translated into the script. So it was kind of me fighting all the time, trying to sort of keep a general overview of a good storyline, and I felt it was sort of slipping away as on the Chinese side. If I was signed on to do a Chinese movie to begin with, i.e. a movie that was meant to appeal to a Chinese audience, then it's a different thing. But originally I signed on. Obviously we wanted it to work in China as well. That was a big thing. But we were trying to make an international movie, and it tended to get pushed a little bit more toward the Chinese side as we were starting to get closer to shooting. Originally, the distributors basically went out to China knowing that this was a project that could be made in China. And this was a period where China was just starting to get into the international co-production side. The distributors had found a producer in China who was very interested in doing the show. And basically he was putting up half of the money for China, for the Chinese side, and then the rest of the world would take the other side. But it turned out that the Chinese producer ended up getting more and more involved and took creative control by putting more finance into it. And so it was always meant to be a Chinese co-production, but in the end it tended to be more of a Chinese production. Our Chinese producer, who was basically in charge at the end of it all, had creative control, ended up sort of rewriting things before we started shooting. And to be honest with you, I actually tried to leave the picture at that point because it wasn't the picture I wanted to make, but contractually I couldn't. When it got to the point where the Chinese producer had started to change the script to the point where I thought it wasn't what I'd signed on to do, I went to the producers and said, look, I think I'd like to walk away from this now. I think this is not what I signed on for. And I was basically told that I couldn't really walk away at that stage because it was too far along, and there's a very good chance. I mean, contractually, I was obligated at that point, and I was told that it could be a little bit more sort of potentially difficult to, if I did walk away, that you might end up sort of having to go to court to sort it all out. And at that point, there was enough of a script that I thought maybe we could salvage it and turn it into something really good. But so it was never a sort of, this is so bad that I've got to walk away from it. But it was definitely not exactly what I intended to do when I signed on for it. I mean, I think we were about 6 or 8 weeks away from shooting at that point, and I figured, well, look, there's enough time, hopefully, to try to get it in the shape that I'd like it to be. But we basically had a script which we couldn't really deviate from at that point, artistically. So it was, hey, make the best of what we've got here.
Outcast stars Nicolas Cage and Hayden Christensen as 12th century crusading knights in China, who battle against a villain who has usurped the throne to the kingdom. Cage's popularity at this time had diminished in the States. He was 8 years removed from the $220 million that National Treasure 2 Book of Secrets had made. Since that time, his biggest box office hits had come in the form of voice acting in The Croods and G-Force. However, in China, Cage was given the Best Global Actor in Motion Pictures Award during the Howding Awards show, which was broadcast to an audience of 800 million people. The Chinese film market is a nut American filmmakers are still trying to crack. Securing a Chinese release of an American film has become quite the hurdle with Chinese censorship laws. You need to read only one headline from The Hollywood Reporter to know what they're up against. Disney's Christopher Robin won't get Chinese release amid Pooh crackdown. You're probably asking yourself why. Why in God's name would a creature as innocent as Winnie the Pooh be banned in the country? A source pins the blame on the country's crusade against images of the Winnie the Pooh character, which has become a symbol of the resistance with foes of the ruling Communist Party, namely Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So with rulings like that, why try to get Chinese approval in the first place? Well, as usual, the answer is money. According to a 2013 Hollywood Reporter article, preliminary data from the world's second biggest movie market shows the strength of homegrown films, but a smaller market for Hollywood fare. Chinese box office revenue rose $760 million to $3.5 billion, an increase of 27% over last year's $2.8 billion. Luckily for the Outcast team, this would be a homegrown project, making its release in China a certainty. In a separate interview, Nick Powell told The Hollywood Reporter that he plans to bring just a few people from Canada for the shoot and will count on a crew made up of 90% of Chinese personnel. He had already met with local production and costume designers during his brief stay in Beijing last week, as well as with local actors to discuss roles in the film. Quote, "I'm starting to set up a production company in China because there is unlimited potential here." Nicolas Cage was also going all in on China. Cage, "I do want to come back, and I want to work with a Chinese director and Chinese actors. If there's something that makes sense for a white guy like me, I'd like to do that here in China." He reiterated that desire in the CCTV interview, saying, "One of my goals is to have a base near mainland China. I think Hong Kong would be a good match for me. I like being in Hong Kong." Near the end of the segment, CCTV's anchor gently challenged Cage on his recent filmography, noting that some critics have questioned his choice of projects. "You can't make your choices based on what critics think. You have to make your own choices, based on what's honest for you. I can't let it bother me. I'm happy. I'm happy making movies I want to make. Something is working." Cage also gave a few hints about his role in Outcast, describing his character as a reformed crusader, adding that Powell, who is British, asked him to put on an English accent for the part. "I'm working with a character who goes through a catharsis, who transforms from a violent man as a crusader to someone who no longer wants that life, and he leaves. When I act, I hear it like music. In my head, I hear the dialogue like music, and the movements like dance. I do design my performances. And then when I get to the set, the part I can't talk about, the magic inside, the sacred part, the emotion, I fill it with that. But I design it first like a performance.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, originally the character was a sort of a bookend, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And obviously, once Nick had signed on, it then got slightly adapted again for Nick specifically. And yeah, I mean, we always knew that if you bring Nick in, you're getting a Nick Cage performance, and there's an energy to him, that you're going to get a lot of energy from Nick. So you were always, aware of that as the writing was going on, and trying to sort of incorporate that in there, and making sure there were enough moments for Nick to bring that out. We were aware of the fact that they were supposed to be Crusaders, so we were trying to stay away from an American accent. And we were trying somewhere in the middle of a mid-Atlantic for both Hayden and Nick. We didn't want to go too English. At the same time, we didn't want to sort of be American, because obviously at that point they would have been sort of English Crusaders, or European at the least. But then we didn't want to get into whether they'd come from Germany or France, so it was a case of some sort of neutral mid-Atlantic kind of accent that we were trying for, and we'd already discussed that sort of months before. And so Nick was working on something, and he came in originally with a very strong English accent, and we talked about it, and he toned it down a little bit, so it was a little less English and a bit more in the middle of sort of not quite American, not quite English. He was going for somewhere in between.
You're the outlaw they call the White Ghost?
I am the White Ghost. But no one calls me outlaw, child. Not to my face!
Your friend sent us here.
My friend? And you expect that to count in your favor?
You saved our lives.
By killing black guards, that was no hardship. Your lives have value. Yes, my love. Shing will pay handsomely for your return.
He might just kill you, outlaw. If we escape my brother, I will be the king.
How old are you? 10?
14!
And I should help you because?
I will give you a reward. And you may come down from this mountain, a free man.
Oh, I don't know. In my experience, those who climb to the top only ever remember they got there by their own effort.
I won't forget.
Maybe you will, maybe you won't. I need time to think. You're lucky my wife likes you. Where's my wine? Free them. They've got nowhere to run.
We had a few phone calls initially. Nick was working on something else, and I was out in China, so we ended up having a few calls, talking about the character and just the arc of the character, and how he may play it and everything else. But when he turned up on set, he turned up about 4 days early, so that he could actually go through all the process of sort of getting everything down and sitting with me and going through the costumes and seeing some of the locations and everything else and getting his head into the character. The thing with Nick is he's very, very professional. So as soon as he turns up, he's got all his lines. He knows the script by heart. The day that he turns up, it's not like he's working through it as we're shooting. He knows everything about it. So the moment he turned up, and I'd had a few costumes designed for Nick to choose from, and he walked up and he said, and I asked him which one he'd like to take on, and he was, well, which one did you want me to wear? And I said, well, this is the one I prefer out of the two. And he said, well, that's the one that I'll be wearing. So he's very good. I mean, he's just very collaborative, very professional. I get on very well with him. He called me up one evening, and we were shooting that sequence the next day, and he said, I was thinking, I mean, this guy, he's got such a sort of an affinity for nature and living in a cave and with the bandits and everything else. He says, and we've got snakes around there. I think he would. I think he's got a thing for snakes. And I said, fine. I mean, let's bring in a couple and see how they work in the scene. And we brought the snakes in, and Nick played with them for a little while. And then it looked sort of like it would work in the scene, so we added them. That was the point where we thought, well, Nick's got to have been gone a number of years from when he and Hayden sort of split ways at the beginning of the movie. It's got to have been a number of years before they come back together, and Nick has to have gone through a lot of heartache and trouble and everything else. And one of the things to show that time period transition was that he'd been in battles, he'd been in situations, and one of the things was he actually had lost an eye in the fighting. We actually did have a scene in the movie where Nick was supposedly in a fight that it got cut out before we started. Nick picks up on different things for different scenes sometimes. So I remember when we were doing the walk and talk in the battle at the beginning, he based it on a character, a well-known actor. I don't think it was Harry Dean Stanton, but it was someone at that point. And Nick's going, there was a great scene in this movie that he did. It's like, do you remember that movie? And it was from the 60s or 70s. And he did this great thing. And I was thinking that this is kind of reminiscent of that. And if I take a piece of that and so Nick sort of, he obviously has sort of visuals in his head and touchstones of things which kind of remind him of certain things that he's doing at that point, and sort of incorporates a little bit of that and a little bit of this. And so Nick's always kind of working on that side of things. Obviously, this was a Chinese type thing, but it was at the same time, we were both more motivated by Japanese movies early on than we were by Chinese movies. And my favorite director is Kurosawa. So, we would talk at length about certain Japanese movies and how he did certain things. And the movie was pitched to me initially by Jeremy Bolt as a sort of an Eastern, which is a strange way, but it was essentially, it's a Western, but set in the East. It's a Sergio Leone movie with Kurosawa, but it's difficult to sort of throw Kurosawa in there because you're in China, and China and Japan have a strange history. And so, you're trying not to sort of go the Japanese route, but you're always trying to sort of incorporate elements that have influenced you since you were young,
You fucking opium. Keeps the ghosts at bay, huh? This is my medicine.
What you saw that day.
It's forgiveness that brought you here. You've come a long way for nothing. Perhaps you've come to tell me it was some terrible mistake, that you didn't kill them.
I can't tell you that, but they didn't die by my sword. I promise.
Riddles give me headaches.
The children were killed by their own mothers. The women died by their own hands.
Because they feared what you have become.
Yes.
What is it? You think if you save this boy, God will forgive you?
Men cannot know God's will. And when they pretend to, it ends in blood.
That I'll drink to.
The strange thing is, our Chinese producer had a way with his casting, and the girl who played Nick's wife was a singer on essentially something like the Chinese Voice. And she'd won the Chinese Voice or something, and she had a lot of followers on Twitter or something like that. So he wanted to bring her in because she had a big following in China, and he thought it would help, sell the movie. She'd never really acted before, so I was very reluctant, but he kind of insisted. And then once we started to shoot, he turned around and said, I'm going to cut some of her scenes out. And at that point, we'd started shooting and everything else, and there were scenes written for her to be in, and our Chinese producer was not sort of overly. He was reluctant to put those scenes to let us shoot those scenes and put them in the movie. He was limiting them. I said the same thing to him. You've cast someone with an amazing singing voice, and she doesn't speak in the movie. But I don't think he understood the irony of the situation.
My wife, she's good with a knife, eh, lad? But at one time, she had the most beautiful singing voice. But the guards cut out her tongue, blinded my right eye. But I still have hair, which is all that really matters.
I did my first cut, and then basically the Chinese producer came in and said, "No, I'm gonna cut it right down," and he ended up cutting it actually too short for a theatrical release. So I then went back and put a few scenes back in, and but there was some things he just didn't like, even though I felt we needed them to tell the story, but he just didn't want that scene in. So he basically, "No, I'm not allowing the scene in the movie." I said, "But you can't. If that scene's not in the movie, then how does the audience know that this is supposed to have happened at this point? I don't care. It's okay. It's a Chinese audience." So it was a difficult post process. I stayed on the whole time with Jeremy, trying to sort of fight to do the best we could to keep it together. But basically, our producer in China had final cut, and then he wanted to turn it into a 3D production, which he did in China, and it was a pretty bad conversion. And he went in on the final mix with the sound and changed the sound around again, and he cut certain things out, and that just didn't make sense because you needed them for the story. So in the end, it wasn't the movie that any of us really signed on. I mean, Nick got the script at a point where it was relatively close to what he signed on to. But, and I remember doing the ADR with him and, going through everything, and he's looking at the movie going, "This is not the way you had it cut originally." And I said, no, unfortunately, that's not the same cut. But I was still on board trying to make sure everything was working so that, Nick's ADR worked and everything else. And even though at that point, I'd wanted to take my name off it, and I'd wanted to walk away, and then after that take my name off it, but I still tried to stay with it and do the best I could all the way through. But that's the least of the problems with the movie, because what actually happened was I was in China doing publicity for it with Hayden and the Chinese actors. Nick was busy on another movie at the time, and the night before, we'd done 5 or 6 nights of publicity already, and it was opening. And in China, the movie was actually getting well received because they'd had previews, like 5 days of previews in 5 different cities. All the previews were packed and sold out, and we went in and spoke to the audiences, and the audiences were very responsive, clapping loudly and cheering and everything, and all going back to see it again. And it was on Thursday evening, and the movie was opening on the Friday. And I was with Hayden, I was with Louis Fei, the Chinese actress, Andy On, the Chinese actor. We were all there, and we got a text message, or at least the actress did, because it was in Chinese, so we couldn't read it. But the lead actress, who was in the elevator with us at the time, said, "The movie's not playing tomorrow." I said, "What do you mean? We've just done 5 days of publicity, and they've already sold tickets, and it's been advertised for weeks." "Well, apparently it's not playing tomorrow." And no one knew. I mean, literally, Hayden and I were sitting there, sort of having just read this email. The email basically told us that due to conflicts with foreign producers, that he was having to pull it off the screens. So I called up the foreign producers and I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, the movie's not playing according to our producer in China. He's saying that you guys are, there's a conflict." "No, as far as we're aware, it's opening tomorrow." No one had any clue that the movie was not opening the next day.
In the aftermath, producer Jeremy Bolt told the LA Times, "I'm confounded. A delay within 24 hours of release is extremely unusual. We went through all the proper approvals. I just don't know what to say. And then told Variety, we've never been given a full explanation for the problems, but it is clear that the Yunnan Film Group still has great confidence in the movie. They had the final cut and paid attention to details that would make the film right for Chinese audiences. They also bought out North American rights, which shows their faith here too. Reasons for the abrupt halt in September remain steeped in mystery and speculation. While some sources have suggested that the Yunnan Film Group had financial difficulties, others said the film had not been able to book the number of screens that the Yunnan Film Group wanted. Other commentary suggested that Chinese censors had reconsidered their initial approval because of the film's high body count and graphic 3D battle images.
Yeah, it was nothing to do with the content. What happened was he wanted more screens. And this was explained to me by someone at his company who was also, they quit because he just basically said, I'm pulling it off the screens. And they said, you can't. I mean, you've got 5,000 screens booked. What do the theater owners do? And he didn't care. He just, because he wanted more screens and they couldn't give it to him because they'd already booked other movies into those slots. And so they couldn't give him the screens he was asking for. And he basically decided to just pull it off the theaters, literally the night before it was opening. And it had a date release in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Cambodia, in places like that, in Asia. And so what happened was, obviously, it opened in Thailand, it opened in Cambodia, and I was told by someone in China, and I don't know if it's true or not, but for a week or two, it was the most pirated movie in China being downloaded illegally because it had already been released in other countries there, and they'd thrown it online. So my assistant in China had emailed me afterwards, said, hey, at least you've got the most pirated movie in China, which was a shame because I think it would have done okay in China. And, it was just a producer who basically decided to pull it off the theaters the night before. He didn't know what he was doing. He'd taken it all on himself to do it. And, that was pretty disappointing for everyone involved. It sort of ruined it for everybody. It was from Nick's point of view, from Hayden's point of view, from my point of view. I mean, to pull the movie off the screens the night before, it's bad for everyone's reputation because, despite the fact that it wasn't exactly what we intended to make at the beginning, everyone worked really hard to do the best they could on the project, and to have it pulled off at that point. I mean, he had 5,000 screens booked, and they had. From what I understood, there was $500,000 in tickets sold on the first screening alone on the Friday, because I know some of the theaters that were having it pulled off them still had their first screening. They still did their first screening the next day because they'd sold so many tickets. The theater was booked. By the time I'd got back from China, Nick had already heard, of course. And again, he was extremely disappointed. I think that's the subtlest way I can put it. Because again, he'd done a lot of work on that movie, and he'd gone into a number of interviews afterwards and tried to do publicity for it in between his other projects. And Nick was looking forward to having to doing a few movies in China. And so was I. And he was looking forward to it coming out. I mean, he told me it was one of the better experiences he's had on a movie set for a while. He enjoyed the process. I was so frustrated at that point. I basically wanted nothing to do with the producer in China or anything else to do with the movie. And so I tried to stay away from it. But then I got another phone call saying, could I go back out for publicity? Because Nick was going out to do publicity on it this time. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I can't come. It's basically after the debacle the last time, I'm not interested in coming out there. And Nick was about to get on the plane, from what I recall when I spoke to Nick. And he was ready to get on the plane the next morning, and they called him up and canceled.
Blackguards are as thick as flies on a farting goat's ass because of you.
And the production company at that point pulled out. The distribution, sorry, not the production, the distribution. They pulled out, and I don't know what happened. I have no idea because, as I said, I'd already kind of walked away at that point. And then I don't know when it actually opened, to be honest. I didn't even know it had opened in China.
The film was eventually released in China on April 3rd, 2015. It would gross a total of $5 million, 4 of which came from China.
Well, the thing is, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And, that was one of those processes where if you've gone through that process, you can pretty much go through anything. I mean, I've worked on a lot of studio movies, and they're a piece of cake in comparison to what I went through on that movie. And not really. I mean, I wanted, when you mentioned sort of this interview and Outcast, I thought it was an opportunity at this point for me to sort of, it's been there a while without me really airing my grievances to anyone, and I figured, you know what, maybe it's time to sort of let people know, if anyone actually wants to know, what really went on there, because I know the movie didn't get good reviews at all, and you kind of look at it and go, well, there wasn't a lot I could do, and there wasn't a lot anyone else could do. It all came down to one person in the end, really. That's actually part of what we were trying to get, and I mean, I saw Nick a few times after Outcast and before Primal, and he loves that death sequence. He thinks that's I mean, he did mention, I think that's probably the best death sequence I've ever had in a movie. So that was nice, at least from that point of view.